Of the over 150 epigrams by Palladas, preserved in the Palatine Codex, a substantial number fall into continuous sequences. Wilkinson has noted that in the Yale Papyrus there are also recurring themes and repeating key words. I wish to illustrate, as time permits, that Palladas used the editorial technique of sequencing to move beyond the kinds of jokes found in earlier Scotic epigram and to create an autobiographical perspective offering a moral critique of his contemporary culture. To the extent possible, I will also point out evidence for thematic sequencing on similar topics in the Yale Papyrus, but I make no promises about any definitive comments on authorship. In the interest of time, I've summarized some of the evidence on the first page of your handout. Roman numeral 1 is evidence for sequencing in the papyrus, most of which has been pointed out already by Wilkinson, and Gianfranco gave us some hints as to these types of evidence earlier today. There are here, as I understand them for purposes of this paper, 4 categories: headings between epigrams that show a connection of topic, and I've quoted some examples. The same proper noun in sequential epigrams, repetition of keywords and themes in close proximity, and repetition of a first-person voice in close proximity, which is a slightly more difficult category to find. As to the Palladas epigrams in the Palatine Codex, this is Roman numeral 2, the clusters of these can be divided somewhat arbitrarily into 3 types, as on the handout. First, pairs of epigrams, some on a single topic, such as the pair on Amphilion's dedication of lock of hair to Isis, which Alex earlier quoted, but not as an epigram pair in his handout. Secondly, short sequences of 3 or 4 epigrams, some on a single topic, such as the 2K becoming this tavern owner sequence, which has also been referenced. And then 6 longer groups found in books 7, 9, 10, and 11, all of which show thematic sequencing, at least in part. So by longer groups, I just mean groups of epigrams, all of which have been ascribed to Palladas, but each of those has some identifiable thematic sequencing. In the most interesting of these sequences, the literary texture of the connections with linkage by key words strongly suggests an origin in an edition made by Palladas himself. Of course, the process of transmission, perhaps through ancient anthologies and through rearrangements made by Cephalus, resulted in some intrusions into sequences and particularly extraction within sequences. So keep that in mind as we move forward, that nothing is definite about the exact nature of the sequence. I will here discuss one sequence in some detail in order to illustrate Palladas's method of arrangement, and then 2 other sequences that are related to each other more briefly. In both cases, possible parallels in the Yale Papyrus will be noted. So the first sequence that I wish to treat is 165 through 175, number 3 on your handout. This series of poems could be considered 2 separate but related sequences, since the first 3 epigrams are voiced in third person and form a tight thematic unit, whereas all but one of the remaining poems are voiced in the first person and show a looser but autobiographical progression. I, however, treat the 11 poems as a unit because the core theme of the sequence, anger, is introduced by the first word in the first poem, orge. It is anger of men and gods that ties together the subsidiary themes of marriage, grammar, poetry, and poverty. The shorter group of 165 to 167 falls into a common type of Scotic epigram targeting a particular kind of person, here, women. Palladas's central thesis is that men are justifiably angry at women because they are by nature a destructive force, which is shown by no lesser authorities than Hesiod and Homer. Logistically, Palladas begins with the origin of woman, recalling obliquely Hesiod's Pandora story in 165. In this abbreviated version of the story, Zeus's anger at Prometheus for the gift of fire to men produced the destructive counter-gift on Tidoron of woman. Note that the syntax of the first phrase, assisted by oral similarity, equates orge with gune, as if Zeus's anger manifested itself in the form of a woman. Turning from Hesiod to Homer, the poet reminds us that Zeus himself was not untroubled in his relationship with Hera, and he says, Homer described Zeus as angry with his wife, te gamete korion, line 8, a phrase that will be recalled later in 173. The second poem in the sequence, 166, opens with verbal linkage back to 165 through the words Homeros and Gunaika. Homer has shown, the poet says, that all women, whether chaste or whore, are a source of ruin. Since in the Iliad, Helen's adultery causes the slaughter of men, and in the Odyssey, Penelope's virtue results in death. Playing with traditional blame directed at Helen, Palladas states that the Iliad exists as a book, an object of labor, ponema, for the sake of one woman, whereas Penelope is the cause, prophecies, of the Odyssey. The beginning of 167 marks the first three poems as a short sequence by reworking the opening couplet of 165. Woman, who was their anger, is now equated with fire, for which in 165 she was the penalty. She is called another fire, pur alo, perhaps with allusion to aloe as a sequencing element. And then, worse yet, an unquenchable fire. The verbal repetition in ring composition in 165 through 167 are reminiscent of certain short sequences in Meleager's Garland, though the slippery, suggestive semantics is more characteristic of Palladas. At the opening of 168, the first-person voice of the poet appears in Gedgameka. Zeus's orge is replaced by Achilles' manes, and the generic gune is replaced by Palladas' own gametes. The move is from the epic to the commonplace, the divine to the human, the universal to the individual, with the suggestion that all's the same on earth as in heaven. Now, manes and gametes are syntactically equated, as if the poet's wife is anger personified. In the last line of this poem, she is called combative, makine, a word emphasized with the sound play in the line. In the pentameter, however, Palladas specifies that his profession is the reason for that he begins with anger. I'm sorry, in the first pentameter, Palladas specifies that his profession is the reason he begins with anger. This refers to the use of the opening of the Iliad to teach grammar to schoolboys, but it also alludes to the poet's own feelings of anger. In the second couplet, Palladas calls himself polumenis, mightily angry, a unique word that plays on polumetis, a common Homeric epithet for Odysseus. Palladas is mightily angry because he has a double, inescapable source of resentment, his dikolo ton anangain, his profession as a grammarian, and his quarrelsome wife. In a programmatic reading of 168, Agnosti has suggested that as a poet in the iambic tradition, Palladas images himself cohabiting with wrath in the form of both a combative wife and miserable grammar. This reading is strongly reinforced, I suggest, by an epigram found in the Syllogy Euphemiana, a collection with early origins in the era of Cephalus's Anthology. And because it's not part of the sequence in AP, I've indented it to the right, so make this clear to everyone. The manuscripts of the Syllogy ascribe it variously to Palladas, an unknown Palladios, or Agathios, but scholars have generally accepted Palladas's authorship. The poem was likely once part of the sequence that we are examining. This supposition is supported by its position in the Syllogy, directly preceding a Palladas poem that is found in the Greek anthology as 11,378. which I will also discuss shortly. The first couplet of the Syllogy poem links to the opening of 168 through the repetition of 4 words, menin, ulomenein, gametein, and particularly Palladas, which only occurs in these 2 poems in this set of things. And the 4 occurrences of the root mak in the remainder of the Syllogy poem linked to makimes, the last word in 168. Here the poet's experience of learning and teaching the Iliad's opening is said to have preceded, perhaps causally, his marriage to a woman who battles him night and day. Silence is impossible because she battles over that as well. The metapoetic implication of particularly silence being impossible is strongly marked by the double quotation of main and I day. Originally, of course, an imperative directed to the muse, here the speaker as husband and as poet is self-directed to sing wrath. That is, to sing about wrath and also to quarrel and to blame, both of which he's doing. The next epigram in the sequence, 169, begins with yet another variant of the Iliad's first line. This is the third one. Menes Achilleos. It introduces the theme of poverty. Achilles' anger is now claimed as the cause of the poverty that Palladas suffers as a grammarian, and it is now penie, that is, ulomene, destructive. He wishes that anger had killed him along with the Danaans before the difficult hunger, kateposimos, produced by grammar, can do so. The phrase ptopos ego genomein, I become poor, makes a striking conclusion. The Homeric adjective topos evokes the beggar Odysseus, so that our poet is beset by both Achilles' wrath and Odysseus' poverty. The following 3 epigrams, 170 through 172, are thematically related to the preceding poems, if less closely linked verbally, all 3 offering strategies for dealing with poverty. In 170, the poet controls the hunger in his belly with reason, while in 171, he decides to sell his books and change his profession. The last word in 170, hupotasomenein, referring to his belly that is subdued by reason, or more literally, placed beneath his nous, provides a verbal link to 171. There, the similar verb, to suntasomai, I bid farewell here to logoi, in turn puns on syntax, which is then said to bring the death of the poet. The theme of changing life's course continues in 172, where Palladas asserts an indifference to hope and fortune and embraces poverty as a form of freedom. He disavows striving for wealth, which he says abuses poverty, hubristain penies. Examples of how the wealthy have done him violence will follow in 174 through 175. The coherence of the sequence becomes even more obvious if we assume that AP 11378, which I mentioned earlier, originally occurred in the same vicinity. Unable to endure wife or grammar, gametes, kairomatikes, the poet proclaims that he has now escaped grammar but can't be rid of his man-battling wife because of legal barriers. The adjective andromakes recalls makimes in 168, as well as words from the same root in the epigram from the Syllogy. This play on andromachy fits well with the Iliadic theme that runs throughout the sequence, and the word kartes, referring in the last line to the unbreakable marriage contract, will appear also in 174 for a discarded scrap papyrus in which his monthly pay is callously wrapped. The next epigram in the sequence, 9173, again plays cleverly with the opening of the Iliad. The beginning of grammar, Palladas says, is a 5-line curse, which he then illustrates by quoting keywords from each of the Iliad's first 5 lines. In the case of the 5th line, he misquotes Homer's Dios boule as Konos Dios. Zeus's plan for the action of the epic is thus replaced with Zeus's wrath, a solipsistic misreading of the Iliad suggests. In the last couplet, the poet identifies the 5 curses as 5 patoses, falls, in the sense of both disasters and grammatical cases. A pun like the one on syntax just above, and as we will see, these puns on grammar are characteristic of the latter part of the sequence. In 174, Zeus's wrath morphs into the wrath of Serapis. In Egypt, those who have angered Serapis, the patron god of healing and material advancement, become teachers who make their start from destructive anger, a play on both the opening of the Iliad and also Serapis' hostility towards them. Palladas then recounts the humiliation he suffers when a lonely nurse is sent to deliver his monthly pay and steals a share for herself, or when his employer in the 11th month of an annual contract reneges and pays nothing for the whole year. The last poem, 175, returns to the selling of his books, now specified as Callimachus and Pindar, the difficult poets. He will also sell the very cases of grammar, which after puzzling over for a while, I decided might mean his grammatical handbooks, which apparently were sometimes constructed by grammarians for use for their students. He is himself, he says, a disastrous case of poverty. The grammatical puns continue as the poet takes revenge on his former student Dorotheus, who ridiculed him by violating the syntaxis, which here means contract, or, that is, syntax. That was Palladas' livelihood. Was he a bad student who didn't know his syntax? I don't know. Dorotheus, I suggest, is perhaps a speaking name, God's gift, or something to that effect, linking back to the first poem in the sequence that begins with Zeus's anti-gift to man. In the end, Palladas asks for a new patron, more godlike. Theon, apparently, he's called, from the text. And he asks him to prevent him from ending his life in conjunction with poverty, sundesimo penies. The sequence, which is thematized at beginnings, thus signals its conclusion with death and poverty, as the poet bitterly multiplies and clusters jokes on his own profession as a grammarian. Palladas seems to have taken great care in composing the sequence, and that suggests that it played a special role in some epigram collection. Although we can only speculate about the placement of the sequence in a poetry book, it is reasonable to surmise that this series, which begins with Zeus and ends with a nod to the poet's future death, has a programmatic, probably proemial function. Lucilius, in a Scotic epigram 11279, satirizes all grammarians because they possess anger, wrath, and bile. Orgain, kaimein, kaikolon, which are the synonyms that Palladas uses. There may actually be an allusion there to Homer, because if you look at this simple Homeric scholia, you will see that students who have the word names explained to them with orge and kolons. In our sequence, Palladas inhabits this persona of the grammarian as an object of epigrammatic ridicule, exploring from an autobiographical perspective what it means to live his life in that subject position. As a grammarian, he sees life always through the lens of literature and the grammar needed to understand it. He suffers from Achilles' wrath, as did the Greeks at Troy, or is married to an Andromache, forever battling him, or is Odysseus, unable to escape his role as beggar. The life of a grammarian is to be entangled in grammar, suffering the ptosis of poverty, the loosening of syntaxes in the breaking of an employment contract or mistaken sentence structure, and ending life a pauper through conjunction. This kind of deconstruction of a Scotic stance against grammarians is designed not just to amuse, but also more seriously to speak what remains unspoken in a genre based on ridicule, that is, what it feels like to be ridiculed. I turn now to the tenuous but interesting connections to the Yale Papyrus on page 4. And particularly, there seem to be similarities to the two Climatius poems on page 4 of the Papyrus. Just as Palladas in 9175 asked his addressee, Theon Philae, to help him with his poverty, in the epigram pair from the papyrus, he asked Climatius for help. Directly in lines 26 through 28 of the second poem, which I quoted for you here, where he addresses his patron as Phil Kate Climatiae, a phrase that he may also, exact same phrase he may also use in line 7 of the first poem. And he also, in line 34, calls him O Philae. In the first epigram, lines 8 and 10 contain the phrase, you were angry, esques in orge. I have no idea why he was angry. Followed by references to the son of Agenor, probably Cadmus and the Muses. So very generally, there's a similarity to the theme of anger and references to mythological figures that we find in the Book 9 sequence. The last clause of the first Climatius poem, Hunepa kai penomai, is remarkably similar to the last clause of 9169, topos ego genomein. We might also compare in a different position in the poem in 917 to 93, eme penes anthropos. In the second of the paired epigrams, the speaker, who is explaining the extent of his destitution, imagines Climatius thinking of him as a teacher, didaskalos. Though the Climatius pair is very different in form from the sequence in Book 9, the number of thematic parallels is not insignificant. There are random similarities elsewhere on the papyrus as well, such as the references to rich people and wives on page 15, one certain and one possible reference to Callimachus, and scattered use of the first person to create the persona of a poet who is elderly, poor, and bitterly angry. Note particularly from page 1231, the poem preserved as 9127 in the Anthology, Hogaron Genetai Oxupolos, where the poet's sharp anger puns on oxos, vinegar, a typical pun. My discussion now of two related politically themed sequences will be very brief. Particularly important is the Gessius sequence, 681 through 688, because the name Gestius appears on the papyrus. The 8 poems appear in the sepulchral book of the Anthology, but do not belong there. 5 of the epigrams repeat just before AP 11-283, which opens a series of 11 Scopic poems by Palladas. This duplication indicates that in Cephalus' source, the Gessius sequence had appeared before the Book 11 sequence, where it's much more comfortable. The 3 poems that immediately follow the Gessius sequence in 11 are 283 through 285, and they're quite interesting because they concern a corrupt official and provide possible thematic similarity to the Gessius sequence. The general shape of the sequence on Gessius is all I'm going to really say about its contents. I'm not going to say anything about historical reconstructions of his life. The first poem reports the essence of the story. In fact, the first line does. Gessius departed from his homeland because of his ambition to gain high office, but instead met with death. That's what we know for certain, really. The remainder of the sequence reworks the general premise that Gessius has violated the old principle of nothing in excess. And all we learn for certain, that from the final 2 epigrams, is that he foolishly believed 2 astrologers who forecast his ascension to high office. Worth noting is Palladas' play on Gessius' name. Scholars have noted the scatological pun in 7683 line 8, Gessius u te Kesein, where Gessius echoes in Kesein, it's thought. That is, like Bellerophon, who was strong of heart, Gessius has a heart that's not well attuned even for shitting. There is also an etymological pun, I think, in 7686 line 6, where Gessius, now in Hades, responds to an interlocutor called Valkyrie, who asks about his dreadful appearance, and he responds by angrily explaining that arrogance brings also death. To strenos kai thanaton pareke. The noun srenos is quite rare, as is the related verb streniago, which is glossed in ancient lexica with atakto, to act without control. Hezekias defines the verb as being hybristic because of wealth and acting impatiently. Todia pluton ubrizein prepareos veren. The Latin verb gestio has exactly the same range of meaning. The Oxford Latin Dictionary offers the variety of meanings as follows. First, desire eagerly, act impatiently, or third, act without restraint, exalt. In the corpus Glassariorum Latinorum, gestio is given the gloss streniago. In other words, in Hades, Gesius reveals that his own name has defined his character, which brought upon him a horrible death. Now, I stress this aspect of the Gesius sequence because it serves as a thematic link to AP 11, 283 through 285, which apparently followed in Cephalus' source. Though these three poems do not name the corrupt official, the Lemmatus labels him a huparchon called Damonicus, or Damonicus in Planides. And I think this cannot be a made-up lemma. It's too specific. It must have come from another epigram on the same character, which we no longer have. It is clearly, like Gesius, a speaking name, a conqueror of the people. This official is satirized as a thief who hypocritically weeps as he steals, and so reveals himself to be an effeminate whose body is polluted. We recognize again Palladas' trademark use of puns. In 283, the official, having come from Chalkis, has denuded the poet's city of its coinage, apet Chalkise. And in 284, this man, who is actually from Egypt, has become a great leader like a Lycaon, who, being from Chalkis, has been back-mounted anti-okiumenos, a sexual pun, unique, referring to his relationship with his superiors in Antioch. The opening statement in 283, that even many people are unable to express in words all the streams of your vices, sets up the reference to a pathos allo, the first line of 285, again I think with a play on epigram sequencing, the allo. His effeminately conducted thefts are here connected to his unclean body, polluted by streams of filth, that is semen. Note how Wupu filth in 285.4 plays on Reuomata streams at the opening of 283 to enhance the obvious ring composition of the three-poem sequence. Now, turning again to the Yale Papyrus, the most important parallel to these two related sequences is clearly the couplet on page 9 that ends with Gestius ain, I or he was Gestius. The rest of the poem is lost, but the past tense implies that Gestius is dead, as in the AP sequence. We might even speculate that this pithy pointed conclusion followed from the same etymological play on Srenos. Gestius' hybristic behavior has confirmed that he was indeed Gestius. Any of you who like the poem cares to do so? The epigram apparently belongs to the section dealing with contemporary political issues that extends from arguably page 9 through page 13 with the repetition of the Prutinus words. The poem that precedes the Gestius epigram has in it Dikostasia, civil strife, and the two following poems concern heritage, Patrozone, and the destruction of Alexandria, apparently the poet's home, Patridos. On page 10 is preserved the Homeric adjective demoboros, devouring the people, an insult hurled by Achilles at Agamemnon for his greedy abuse of power. In formation and meaning, it has a close similarity to the name of the corrupt Damonicus. There follows a first-person epigram on local attempts to stop stasis by sending ambassadors to Hades, which offers a parallel to Gesius' descent to Hades in 682 and 686. A poem on page 11 containing the words Plute, Hupercain, and Prutinis indicate a poem on greedy officials, like the Huparchos Dominicus. Kevin has noted that the topic of theft in office and a poem at the bottom of page 13 is reminiscent of the Dominicus sequence, and we had a good bit of discussion about this yesterday. I find this supplement to line 31, Pithanois Dakusi, quite attractive. However, it could also be Pithanois Remasi. Persuasive words are a possible way to steal from a city by fraud. But I have to say that Dakusi makes a better poem. So we appear to have in the Yale Papyrus a long section on political matters in Egypt, in which there appear both a poem on Gestius or Gestius and a poem on a corrupt official, whether Dominicus or someone similar to him. So the arrangement of Palladas epigrams in the Anthology, very briefly, shows that Palladas used epigram sequencing in the manner of sophisticated sequences in the Garland and Meleager to extend the scope and complexity of epigram form. As we look darkly through the lacunae on the papyrus, we find a variety of similarities in theme and style. And while these similarities are not probative as to the authorship of the new collection, they do provide additional circumstantial evidence linking the papyrus epigrams to Palladas.